One of the great things this year with Great Decisions has been the addition of complimentary coffee from Umbria Coffee Roasters, who are our neighbors in our building. So let's give Umbria a big hand. As per usual, we have books for sale. If you haven't gotten your Great Decisions book, they're $32 for members, $35 for non-members. Just go ahead, become a member already. You'll save a buck or two.
You must have.
The email must be.
And we've got some new speakers this year. We've got, I'll introduce her in a minute, but we have Liang from Willamette University. We've got a couple of people from Willamette this year, which is nice to sort of broaden the pond, so it's not all PSU speakers. And we've got some things coming up. You might have seen them scrolling through here. We've got Samantha Power next week. We have our young professionals do a thing called long reads, where they send out a long-form piece of journalism, and they get together at the Rose City Book Pub up on Northeast Fremont and discuss it on Sunday mornings. And they're looking at Conflict Chocolate, Coco's Child Laborers on the 26th. We also have a really unique event with Tim Boyle from Columbia Sportswear coming up. Tim is going to talk about free trade and global engagement and why it matters for Oregon and the US. That's on the 29th at the Old Church. Everything I'm mentioning is on our website at worldoregon.org. February 12th, Karen Sherman, who is an Oregonian originally, who founded the first women's college in Rwanda, is going to be here talking with Lisa Shannon, the Congo activist, on Brick by Brick, building hope and opportunity for women survivors everywhere. So that's another good thing to keep on your radar. Next week, we have a climate change discussion. What are you looking for? We've got a climate change discussion with Elliot Cohen, who is the Deputy Director for Climate Policy at Mercy Corps. He'll be in this room. I think he's going to be doing some really innovative things with instant polling.
Okay.
So that will be some fun for us to play with.
Pockets or something?
And as we're getting
I will just,
Yan
okay.
all wired up, I'm going to
Thank you.
talk about her, and perhaps embarrass her with a long bio. Yan Liang is an associate professor at Willamette University. She specializes in post-Keynesian institutionalist approach to international trade and finance. Yes, there will be a test on this afterwards. She has published articles in International Journal of Political Economy, the Journal of Economic Issues, the Chinese Economy, and China and the World Economy. Her teaching interests include macroeconomics, international economics, economic development, monetary theory, and financial systems and political economy of East and Southeast Asia. She's taught at the University of Redlands and at Bard College at Simon's Rock, which I have so many friends who like it.
Oh, really? That's great.
She received a master's degree and a doctorate degree in economics from the University of Missouri, Kansas City, KCMO, for any of you in the know. And she is an active member of the Association of Evolutionary Economics, the Union for Radical Political Economics, and the Association for Institutional Thought. And she's going to lead us down the road of China into Latin America.
Thank you.
Give her a hand.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for inviting me. I feel really privileged and honored to talk to a very different audience than I usually face in the classroom or elsewhere. So thank you so much for being here. So I'm trying to make a really sort of short presentation just to give you some sort of highlights and about China's presence in Latin America and Caribbean for that matter. Also sort of zoom in on the very recent initiative, which is the so-called Belt Road Initiative. And then I will take questions, and I would like to have more interactive discussions, because that's usually the fun part. We could definitely expand our topics. I've been doing a series of TV interviews with the Chinese global TV network about the US-China trade tension, which I think is very much relevant to what we're going to be discussing about today. So feel free to ask questions as we go along. So I zooming on the Belt Road Initiative because I think, again, this is something new that really started very recently. And I think it's going to provide a lot of different talking points, a lot of changes that we'll be seeing in decades. So let's take a look at what this is about. Oops, sorry, this one doesn't want to stay. So just a very quick word about the so-called Belt Road Initiative. So for those of you who may or may not know, this is an initiative launched in 2013 by President Forever, Xi Jinping in China. And what it's trying to do is basically revive the ancient Silk Road. So it includes both the so-called Silk Road economic belt, which is actually the land route to connect China, Central Asia, and all the way to Africa. Sorry, I should go that way. And it also includes the so-called modern maritime Silk Route, which is the ocean, right, connection. And what it's trying to do is just promote the so-called 5 connections. In Chinese, we call it 五通. So to promote both infrastructure building, unimpeded trade, financial integration, and also people-to-people connectivity. So this is a very ambitious project. It has right now over 130 countries signed on to this, and there have been 3,116 projects in more than 57 countries. So far, it has disbursed about $600 billion of investments in all these countries. So, of course, this is sort of something new for China, for the global economy, for the global world, and it's even newer for Latin American countries because at the very beginning, Latin American and Caribbean, I will call LAC from here on, it's not part of the so-called Belt Road Initiative, right? But very quickly, in 2017, 4 years after the launch of the program, President Xi Jinping announced that LAC is a natural extension of the BRI. So Panama was the first country that jumped in and signed on to the BRI. And then in the 2 years following 2017 to now, 19 countries out of the 33 LAC countries are part of the BRI. So they all jumped onto the bandwagon, with notable exceptions of those 4 largest LAC countries, including Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, and Colombia. So even they're not really part of the official BRI partner countries, they are not excluded from China's overarching establishment in Latin American and Caribbean countries. One thing that I wanted to point out as a context is why just naturally the BRI would be extended to LAC is because in the past 20 years, China and LAC had really increased their connections as far as trade and investments are concerned. Because these two regions, they really have a lot of economic complementarity, right? China needs a lot of agricultural products, minerals, and energy, and Latin American countries and Caribbeans are the ones to provide those. And that also got accelerated since China and US started the so-called trade war, right? So I just wanted to show one thing about the trade connections is that bilateral trade between China and LAC has gone up by 25 times from 1999 to just 2018. China is the second largest trading partner with LAC. And Xi Jinping wanted to even double down on that, right? He wants to achieve a total volume of $500 billion of trade by 2025. That's why I think China has the intention to extend the BRI to include LAC, right, which is a advisable choice. Like I said, LAC, a lot of countries are very enthusiastic about this. They usually hold either neutral or positive view. Brazil was an exception, but it also had recently very much changed their attitude. I'll talk about this in a little bit. But according to Comune, the Chilean ambassador, said in 2017 that BRI promotes mutual reliance, economic complementarity, and technology transfers between China and Latin America. So I think that it's a very nice statement that shows why this project could be mutually beneficial. So let's take a look at the potential benefits. So one thing that we know for LAC is they are facing, just like a lot of underdeveloped or emerging markets, a very substantial infrastructure deficit. We're talking about $1 trillion of infrastructure deficit in Latin American countries. As some of you have traveled into those areas that you know, 60% of the Latin American countries' roads are not paved. 2/3 of their sewages are not treated. So they're very much underdeveloped in terms of infrastructure, and that's what China is willing to offer. Because China not only has the deep pocket in terms of investment dollars, but they also have the building capacity. China has built the longest, cumulative longest railway in China, right? So I think this is something that China is able to offer. Because of the lack of infrastructure and connectivity, Latin American countries have the lowest intra-regional trade, right? So countries in that region trade with each other, and it's the lowest among all the other continents. So it's important to keep in mind that what China has to offer and what these LAC countries are in need of. So some of the very important projects, port in Panama and the railroad in Bolivia, the bi-oceanic railway in Peru and Brazil, railway in Argentina, and the list to go on, right? And the very important, I didn't include that, but the transmission of the electricity line between Peru and Brazil, right? So there's a lot of very important infrastructure projects. One caveat here is, in fact, 2/3 of China's infrastructure project right now, investment in Latin American countries, consists of the so-called brownfield or merchant acquisition. So the real new project, the so-called greenfield investment, was only 1/3 at the point. But that could definitely change over time, okay? And some other benefits in addition to infrastructure, because most of the time when people talk about BRR, people talk about infrastructure. But I think in addition to that, there are other things that China can offer. One thing is about the mobile pay, right? The fintech, the financial technology, telecommunication infrastructure is also what China can offer. China is leading in the 5G technology, and it has also very well established the top notched mobile pay system, right? If you go to China these days, if you bring your RMB, the Chinese yuan, you're not gonna go anywhere. You're not gonna get anything. You need to bring your phone. You need to download that little, the scan code, right? So that's where you pay the street vendor, you pay the beggar with your mobile pay. Yes, I should have included the picture, but the mobile pay, right, it's important in the sense that it really improved the inclusivity of financial services, which is a lot of the underdeveloped countries are not able to provide to their population. And again, as I mentioned earlier, even though some of the most important LAC countries are not part of BRI, nevertheless, they're getting a lot of loans from China. Argentina, Brazil, they're very prominent borrowers from China. So Chinese banks have lent more than $140 billion between 2005 and 2018. And that's more than World Bank and Inter-American Development Bank combined. So China does have a lot of sort of financial prowess at their disposal. So I just wanted to sort of end the potential benefits here with one quote that I think really summarizes very well. China, by not imposing policy prescriptions in its commercial and financial dealings, no strings attached pretty much, provides its Latin American country partners with policy space to advance their own economic and political alternatives, including state-led practices that clash with the US agenda. So right there, right? So I think this is very important is that, China respects this country's sovereignty. They're not attaching any strings. They're not a complete sort of follower of the so-called Washington consensus. They allow these countries to draft their own policies. And I think that is very important to keep in mind when we do a balanced assessment of China's initiative. Okay, well, just a little picture to change gear a little bit. This is a Coca-Cola Sinclair. It's a dam in Ecuador. It's one that's subject to very heavy criticism. The argument is it doesn't really produce electricity, and it's also impose really huge financial burden on Ecuador. We're talking about, in total, Ecuador is borrowing about $19 billion from China, and that is totally unbearable for a country of its size. So there are some projects that are really sort of need to be worked on, need to be improved. And this is a port, I believe in Brazil. It's one of the biggest container terminals in Brazil. This is the one that China acquired 90% of stake. So this is a brownfield investment. China didn't build it, but China acquires it, right? And of course, with improvements, it's gonna improve its sea transportation. But that is another example where the critics will find issue with it, right? But they're also observers believe this is a great project that would really help to improve sea transportation and trade. And last but not the least, in Chile, that gets us later to talk about the environmental concerns that many people voiced. But this is a project that China is building solar panels, and China is very good at it. It is the largest producer of solar panels in the world. It has actually a lot of excess capacity that China produce those that they cannot really use and cannot sell to other countries. So here is a place where the resources can be in good hands, right? Of course, BRI is often considered as a double-edged sword. So here comes some of the potential downsides, some of the potential disadvantages. Like I mentioned, some critics very quickly point out that a lot of these investments are not greenfield. And they don't hire a lot of local workers. China typically brings a lot of professional, skilled workers with them and managers as well. So they don't necessarily provide a lot of job benefits to those local economies. They also fail to protect environment, and they also a lot of times break market terms. They're setting up some of the sort of political agreements without sort of respect to really market demand and supply, so to speak. They support corrupt regimes. Venezuela is often the prominent example that people often mention, right? Because China supported Chavez and now Maduro's very oppressive political regimes. It also leads to the debt trap, which again, this is a huge concern, not only for LAC, but many other countries. Because a lot of low and middle income countries are simply not able to pay off the debt that they are borrowing. And finally, with all those integration, a lot of local firms simply cannot compete with Chinese producers. Mexico, for example, a lot of industries are competing head-to-head with the Chinese producers. So there's a question about whether or not that competitive pressure is going to promote the local economy or is going to crush the local economy. Okay. So these are just some of the examples that I wanted to sort of substantiate a little bit those claims, right? What evidence we have? Well, we have evidence about some of the dams don't really produce electricity as they're supposed to. The rail track has destroyed, tropical rainforest, Amazon, and so on. And they're also talking about a $8 billion nuclear project in Argentina, which again, made a lot of people lose their sleep at night when it comes to environmental impacts and so on. So here's a quote from 3 researchers who basically said that most projects in Latin American countries have faced a local backlash because of environmental concerns and pollution and harm to residents and livelihoods. Land acquisition and so on and so forth drive the local indigenous populations out of their normal, environment and so on and so forth. So that's for sure a concern. There are also some human rights sovereignty issues. One of the examples that I included here is in Ecuador. There are many these China, the central surveillance camera, they were installed on their streets. So the benefit of doing that is that really help to fight crimes. But it could also be used for surveillance and and many other possible uses. And so that gives people a chill, right? Like what China is going to use those data for. Another very sort of often talked about issue is that China and this Argentina's president reached a deal where it allowed China to operate a satellite station with the Chinese military running the space station. So that's not only, scares these Argentinian population, but mostly Americans, right? This idea that, if they control the space, that means they control a lot of, airstrikes or some of the other sort of potential, warlike scenarios, and also information. So that, again, it's become really problematic. And El Salvador, that's another example. They basically reached a deal with the previous president to allow El Salvador to set aside about 19% of their national territory as the so-called special economic zone that basically give preferential tax treatments to Chinese companies. And that is not democratically accountable agreements, right? Okay, finally about the debt trap, which is what I mentioned earlier, that a lot of those loans arguably are for political purposes, or they're not really given out under due diligence. They didn't do their job to check the debt's payment capacity, right? And so that could put these countries in the debt trap. And what would happen then is China will go in and take their assets. And so that became, again, a very problematic issue, right? I would argue it's not in China's interest to do that. Nonetheless, it did happen in some places and sometimes, right, some projects. I think this is another issue that is often, it's also, in Mayer's article that I believe some of you might be able to get a chance to skim through. But one of the things is about, okay, China is able to bring all these benefits, right, to Latin American countries. And we know the US has dialed back in terms of their engagement with Latin American countries, right? Not only building the war or saying that they're going to build a war, but also reneging a lot of the foreign aids, right? So as the US is in some ways scaled back from their engagement with a lot of American countries, it provides this vacuum for China to swamp in. So this is the problem where to a lot of the Latin American countries, they're put in this very uneasy position where they are somehow forced to pick a side, right? Do we choose to work with the United States or do we choose to work with China? And that definitely bothers, right, the U.S., right? So I'm quoting Senator Rick Scott, a Republican from Florida, who basically said, in countries just a few thousand miles and sometimes a few hundred miles away, China is taking every opportunity it can to gain influence and exert control. Latin America is the new battleground in the greatest geopolitical conflict of our time. So again, depends on who you ask, right? Some people will think this is a red herring. China has no political interest in Latin American countries, except trying to chaos some of the countries to recognize China being the legitimate country, not Taiwan. And some of the countries did switch their sides, and that is, one I think the biggest political objectives of China. But other than that, as far as current time is concerned, we don't see, right, much of sort of the political agenda that China is actively pursuing in Latin American countries. But nonetheless, I think there are belief that this is the way China is trying to get at the US from the back door. But I think, the strategy for really Latin American countries is, not to sort of really pick a side, right, but on the issue on each basis. Right? Sometimes in some projects, it makes sense to cooperate with the United States. Right? Other times, I think China will be a great collaborator. So I'm again quoting some of the researchers who have taught really, I think, very cogently, right, that Latin American states appear to calibrate their alignment with Beijing and Washington based in part on the economic ties integration in each great power, in part on their ideologies, and in part based on the specific issue under consideration. And I think one interesting irony here is that, even though it seems that Latin American countries have to pick a side, and that's very difficult for them to do, right? They don't want to upset the United States. They don't want to give up China. But a good thing about that, sort of a competition of US and China in Latin American countries, is they actually incentivize the US to be more engaged with Latin American countries. So as some of you might know, that in 2018, US actually overhauled the OPIC, the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, and the DCA, the Development Credit Authority, to combine these two institutions to create the so-called International Development Finance Corporation. And they doubled the capital invested in this company to the tune of $60 billion. And this is the investment corporation that focused on emerging markets investments. So what we see here is that US, trying to, in some ways, emulate China, right? Trying to pay more attention, try to invest more, and try to get a more, solid foothold in some of these countries. Okay, so looking forward, and this is my last slide, so we're getting there. So China is responding to some of these concerns, right? China is not turning a deaf ear to some of these very legitimate concerns about debt sustainability. So China's Ministry of Finance established the BRI debt sustainability framework based on the IMF standards. And the State Administration of Foreign Exchanges, the SAFE, they also produce country-specific reports on exchange rate arrangements and movements, and trying to monitor, right, how these countries are able to safeguard their exchange rates. The Ministry of Commerce, the MOC, established investment guidelines for, again, different countries to guide the government and private investments in the LAC. And then when it comes to the environmental concerns, there was huge ambitious step that has been taken. China's Ministry of Ecology and Environment, MOEE, launched the International Green Development Coalition with 26 environmental ministries. 2 of them are from Latin American countries, 69 research institutes, and 30 companies to promote environmental sustainability, right? So they do important environmental impact assessments when they launch projects and whatnot. The Export-Import Bank supports the so-called green finance development, so they would invest heavily on, for example, alternative energies and other projects alike. When it comes to human rights issues, China has just agreed 284 recommendations. I know that's a lot. China has 4 years to try to implement those recommendations based on the Human Rights Council of the United Nations recommendation. And I also want to quote from Mayer, who is basically eloquently, I think here, talked about what is the right strategy for Latin American countries. Because there's a give, there's a take, right? So I think China is not dictating the terms of collaborations and cooperations. Latin American countries have the power, they have the vision. Is it? Okay. They have the power, they have the willingness, and they have the capacity to do something for themselves, to steer the projects toward their national development goals. They don't have to take the wholesale packages from China. They should be more involved from the entire process of those BRR projects, from planning, from negotiating, from implementation, and all the way to assessment. They need to take a more active role. And I think countries that we have seen, for example, Malaysia, right? They have done this. The previous president have set up some deals with China, but the new president said, hey, these deals don't look good to us. We have to renegotiate, and they were able to do that to cut down the costs. Because even though, yes, China has a lot of power, right, in terms of giving investments and so on and so forth, these receiving countries, they also have the power to negotiate. And finally, I think I would just end my presentation with the last quote here from Pei Zhang, who is the director of the Atlantic Organization, I believe. he said that the development of hard infrastructure remains front and center in BRI, so all the infrastructure projects, but soft infrastructure, regulatory, scientific, and other cooperation mechanisms is rapidly emerging as priority in the BRI area. So again, I think it's important to keep in mind, it's not just about building all these hardware, but a lot of these soft connections, a lot of these soft structures would be also a great area to explore, to tap into. So with that, I will stop, and I welcome any questions or comments or critiques if you are gentle.
China's been in Africa for a long time. What do you see of the good and bad of them doing this type of thing in Africa for a long time?
Right. So again, I think just like in LAC, Africa is a mixed story, right? There are definitely successful cases where, China's investment is helping the local economy and so on and so forth. So one of the things that I didn't mention that I should is that according to some of the research institute, their estimate is once the Belt and Road is completed, this is going to boost international trade by about 6%, and that will increase the global real income by about 2.9%. So we're talking about really substantial improvements in the global economy, in people's livelihood. But I think there are a lot of similarities between African countries and Latin American countries in the sense that these countries are facing really very significant infrastructure deficit. They really struggle with financing power to build economies. And they also wanted to develop their own economy to meet their own interest. And I think the Western world has imposed, as we all know, structural adjustment reforms back in the 80s and the 90s, and they didn't really do well for those countries. So I think China presents new opportunities for not just African countries, but also Latin American countries. And I do believe the so-called mutual benefits, because a lot of things, these countries, these regions, they're complementary. But of course, I think again, both sides need to improve the way they perceive, they implement, they assess, they monitor the projects, right? Some of the projects will be more beneficial than others. Some of them are more of the sort of long-term sustainable projects, and we need to encourage those without string attached, right? But definitely there are projects where we know it's not going to go anywhere. And I think China knows this, and they need to be careful, because if China had a lot more financing power before this trade war and before its own structural reform, as we know that at the peak, China has about $4 trillion of foreign exchange reserves. 4 trillion. So they are able to disperse the money at their own will. But that's no longer the case. Right now, China's, the so-called current account, the trade surpluses have shrank. And it has quite a bit of capital flow since 2015. So now we're looking at China's foreign exchange reserve to about 3 trillion. I mean, that's still a lot, right? From 4 trillion to 3 trillion. But that still means that China needs to be careful, right? They need to be careful in terms of what projects that would really help them. Because a lot of times, people say, well, China doesn't really care, because if they invest in the port and the port does not become profitable, they can take the port. So they would not lose anything. And I think that it's a very bogus argument, because if the projects don't really work, then they're just useless. It does not bring in foreign exchanges for China, and China needs that, right? I'm writing a paper right now on the so-called RMB internationalization, so when China can use the Chinese yuan to invest. Because right now, most of the BRI projects are still in dollars, which China has no control over, right? So I think it's in the interest in China and Africa and Latin American countries all together to really build this genuine collaborative projects that are really conduct due diligence, assessments on the project-to-project basis to make sure they're long-term sustainable and respect all the other concerns.
So your answer to the last question is very pertinent to what I'm going to ask, and slide in particular, because you talk about the problem where you don't have, China doesn't have control of dollars, and specifically China doesn't have control of petrodollars.
Yes.
We look up here and we see gas and oil pipelines that are integral to this, and we are in this crisis, this emergency of climate change, where everything that, whatever we did, the playbook of how the United States outsourced manufacturing to put the environmental challenges on other developing countries has left us in this position of whatever growth is and how we determine what it still is dependent on fossil fuels. So I'm just wondering how we, how we can look at this in the global context of climate change. I mean, you know, not only what China does, but what we do, and whether in fact anything that these accusations of currency manipulation toward China are still relevant. You know, how does the petrodollar play into that?
But these are really wonderful questions. I think I will first address a little bit the climate change issue. I think, you know, as we all know, we are all frustrated by, you know, the United States, I mean the Trump administration to be more specific, you know, taking a huge step back from that commitment to deal with, you know, climate change. And I think that provides, again, a perfect vacuum for China and European countries to step in, to take a leadership role in that area. And I think China has been aggressively trying to really, you know, put climate change as more of the front line of its policy making. I mean, China, like many other countries, just struggled in this sort of trade-offs between economic growth and environmental sustainability. But I think it leads to the point where China cannot ignore that anymore. You know, it cannot continue with sort of develop first and clean later kind of strategy. It doesn't work, right? That has been proven that it doesn't work. I mean, also, you know, with China's growth, with a very large 300 million middle class, right? They are getting richer and richer, and they appreciate clean air more and more. Right? They're worried about their living condition of themselves and their, you know, offspring. So they really have this very strong demand for clean air, and that's why I think Beijing has to take action. And so I'm optimistic about, you know, China will respect and trying to take concrete actions to address, you know, climate change. And China has been doing that, right? For example, this, you know, solar panel example. That said, China did have a lot of the coal mining and oil refinery projects included in the BRI. So like you said, United States pretty much offshore a lot of their polluting industries to other countries. So by the way, one thing, you know, we often hear is that, well, why should the US, you know, reduce carbon emission if China is doing it well? Well, one thing that we need to keep in mind, China is still a developing country, right? When it talked about, you know, reducing carbon emission, the US maybe would just turn down the air conditioner for 1 minute or two. But in China or in other developing countries, it may mean, you know, the factory shuts down, people don't really even have a job. And not to mention, you know, a lot of the Chinese manufacturing is going abroad, right? There's some research that has shown that about 2/5 of China's manufacturing produced in China actually are not consumed in China. In other words, China is polluting itself to provide consumer goods for other countries. So I think where I'm going here is that, you know, I think China needs to take care of the environment. It has to. It has no choice whatsoever. But it also needs to be careful that, you know, climate change is a global issue. It's not like as long as we shift the factories elsewhere, then we'll take care of the problem. I think they recognize that. And that's why, as I mentioned, they have built this sustainable, you know, coalition in trying to deal with that problem. So I'm confident. I wanted to sort of strike a more positive and optimistic tone, and we certainly hope so. And China did make a lot of progress, right? They have already met their Paris Agreement goal earlier to reduce the carbon emission earlier than they're scheduled to do. So I think there is some optimistic future there. When it comes to manipulation of currency, and I think that it's a very controversial issue whether or not China is manipulating its currency. I mean, in my class, I usually talked about, you know, they have this sort of managed flow system since 2005. And the US would claim China as a policy manipulator if the change in the currency value is not its favor. So in other words, if China actively interferes and try to depreciate the Chinese yuan, the US does not like it, right? It would call China as a currency manipulator. But if China steps in government, if Chinese government steps in and trying to stabilize the currency value and not let the Chinese yuan slide to gain the so-called competitive advantage in trade, then US likes that kind of intervention. So, this is very sort of a double standard, in my opinion. But nonetheless, I think what happened is that it's also in China's interest not to manipulate the currency, because it's, if it does want to get the dollar, to get the yuan to be cheaper, right, because that's better for trade, it's going to create a lot of problems with its own financial order. In other words, if you make your currency devalued, this is going to shape the expectations of the international investors and speculators. So what would happen is they would try to attack your currency, they would take the capital and flight, and that could really destroy the financial order. So I don't think it's in China's interest to so-called manipulate the currency. And by the way, when the US determined, the US Treasury determined that China was a currency manipulator back in last year, August, almost around that time, the IMF, which is the real watchdog, right, for currency system, published a report about 4 days after the US Treasury and basically dismissed this claim that China is a currency manipulator. And also just earlier this month, the Treasury actually decided that they were going to stop calling China as a currency manipulator. They took that title off. So I think, all this contention about currency manipulator, it has a lot of political purpose in it. So,
looking at your map and reading the charts, could you explain how the Belt Road Initiative, BRI, differs from colonialism, economic colonialism, versus the British, French, German military colonialism? The two seem very similar, though the BRI, the Chinese initiatives may be a bit softer. But the end result might very well be the same.
right. I mean, the BRI was called many different names by, from a Western or, maybe broader audience that said this is a new Marshall Plan, right? This is imperialism. I think one key distinction here, again, is with no string attached. In other words, the idea is that we're not going into a country and trying to get all your assets and make you, sort of a political subordinate, right? So the idea here is, I think, again, we go back to emphasize this idea that China is still a developing country. It has no interest to challenge the U.S. hegemonic power as the hegemonic power in the world. What China is concerned is how to develop this country with 1.4 billion people, how to feed them, right? How to clothe them, how to build a livelihood for these people to maintain political and social stability. It's not in China's interest to go to other people's land to make them part of, China's, attachment, right? So I think that's the key distinction. I don't think that China has a political ambition in those countries. It's not trying to conquer those countries and make them part of China. And there's no specific string attached, except for, I think, hoping these countries will recognize China instead of Taiwan being the sort of the sovereign country, the representation of China, right? So I think that is the key distinction, right?
When, with all this hundreds of billions or more of investment in these countries, is it a lot of strings attached in so that this money has to be spent in China, back in China, and so that would increase their exports in? And also, do the Latin America, the LAC countries, do any of them play one against the other with all the Chinese interests as they go to the United States and say, what kind of deal you give us, what kind of deal will China give us, or aren't they playing that game?
So So for your first question, no, in the sense that these investments, right, they could boost trade. So in other words, these investments, seaports or railways or roads, they could improve trade between China and these Latin American countries. It could also boost the intra-regional trade. So let's say Brazil trade with Argentina, so on and so forth. So it's not necessarily that will surely increase China's exports to those countries. In other words, it's not necessarily, I invest in you, then you have to buy my goods, right? That said, it is true that, these countries would import a lot from China in terms of, cement, for instance, right? Or steel, for that matter, because China has a bunch of them and they wanted to sell them out. But at the same time, China is buying from Brazil, right? China is buying a lot of soybeans, as some of you often heard this idea that 70% of the soybean in Brazil are shipping to China. So China is buying a lot of petrol, buying a lot of minerals, copper, iron ore, soybean, and many other products from Latin American countries as well. So in other words, it's two-way street. It's not just the money goes back to China, but China also spend in buying things from Latin American countries. That said, right now, China is running a trade surplus overall with the BRI countries. So with all the other BRI countries, China is running a trade surplus right now. But again, that may not be the case as China strengthens its own growth. Its middle-income consumers are going to buy a lot more from the rest of the world, right? So when it comes to playing the game, I don't think they're actively doing that, but I think the U.S. is definitely eyeing on, what China can offer and what we can do in return. Yes, and hence I talked about the International Development Finance Corporation that the U.S. recently overhauled. I think that is a strategy, right, trying to outcompete China, or at least, balance with China's power. Yeah.
Hi. Thank you for coming here and presenting a perspective that we generally don't get, because we are, being Americans, we get information from the American media, and this perspective is really helpful.
Thank you.
I wanted to kind of piggyback on the question that somebody else asked about colonialism, and it's the debt trap that you talked about. Mm-hmm. It's being positioned as neo-colonialism. And we have seen the British kind of doing the same thing, mm-hmm. where the trade is how they got in, and mm-hmm. eventually it became about taking over the country. Mm-hmm. And what concerns me, when you look at China's track record and history when it comes to human rights stuff, like one of the things people talk about is China don't have Netflix in their country. Mm-hmm. The only thing that they binge watch is their own people. They're constantly, with artificial intelligence, machine learning, there's, you guys have a social scoring system going on. Does that, when you think about this, BRI initiative, mm-hmm. how do you reconcile all of that?
I think this is a very complex issue. I agree, right? China definitely doesn't score very well when it comes to human rights issues, and we know that. But to be fair and to be balanced, right? One of the things that China has done since the founding of, the People's Republic of China in 1949 is it has lifted more than 400 million people out of poverty, abject poverty that we're talking about. And I think that's a huge human rights improvement, right? Without food, without clothes, without shelter. What are you talking about human rights, right? You don't even have the basic survival rights. So I think it is true that China has a long way to go when it comes to improve human rights. But at the same time, I think China has been always clear that they do not infringe on sovereignty issues of other countries. So in other words, China does not think it's any other country's position to go to a country and tell you how you should treat your people. Because there are all these different reasons for why that should not be done, right? Because your human rights standard doesn't necessarily apply in different countries. And if you cannot colonize the country and build the country from ground up. I think the country themselves need to build themselves. And not to mention there are United Nations, there are international labor organizations, there are all the other supranational organizations to do the job, instead of letting China or the US, for that matter, to police around to tell what other countries should do. Now, when it comes to all the surveillance mechanisms of China, I agree this is problematic, but I don't want to say that this is only something that China is doing. I mean, the United States is doing exactly the same thing, right? I mean, Amazon has been working with the United States government to build the facial recognition, technology. And we are all monitored, right? Your phone, the data could potentially be utilized by the US government. So I think what we need is some sort of international agreements and governance system, how we should collect data, how we should disseminate data, how we should respect privacy, and so on and so forth. I mean, don't get me wrong, people are talking about, Huawei is going to cooperate with Chinese government and they're going to get all your data and send them off to the government. Well, what about Apple, right? What about Google? I think this is an issue not just for China, but for the entire world population. And I think this is something that we have to tackle together instead of pointing the finger at China and say, you are doing all these awful things. But you know what, I'm doing it too. And so, yeah. I'm not saying that because US is doing it, so China is legitimate to do these things. But I'm just trying to say that this is not just China's problem. I think it is the world's problem. How we really, in a way, confront with and live with technology, right? A lot of times the ethics is behind the technology, right?
Do you believe that a US-China trade deal will primarily benefit the US and China, or will it serve to genuinely promote the economic growth of Latin American countries, given that they've already been put into a debt trap?
This is a great question. I think, first of all, trade war, it does not produce any winner in a trade war, right? Trade war is basically it's creating losers. The matter is, who lose less and who lose more, right? There are countries who benefit in a way from the US-China trade tension, right? Vietnam, a lot of the companies shift away from China and go to Vietnam. Brazil, Argentina, they got some improvements in their agricultural exports. But that said, the total global economy is suffering because of the trade war. Again, IMF has run the numbers, the Congressional Budget Office in the US also run the estimate that the US-China trade war could slow down the global growth rate by as much as 0.5%. We're talking about growth rate of the global economy from 3.3% to 3%, right, or even more than that. So I think trade war does no good for the US or China or the global economy for that matter, even though temporarily you might have some countries that could benefit from the trade diversion. But we all talk about the China is suffering from this trade war, but you know what, the US as well, even though Trump keeps saying that Chinese are paying the tariffs. And we all know when you go to buy a washing machine, right, that you see the price that jump up by 21% and you wonder why and who is going to pay for that, right? The New York Federal Reserve just ran the estimate that almost 100% of the tariffs are paid by US companies and consumers. So we are footing the bill. Right, and going back to the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, has just also run the estimate that the trade war pretty much reduced the household income per household by $580 just since last year. 2 years ago, now we're 2020 already. But since the trade war started in January 2018, that the average household income has gone down by $580. So we are the ones who foot the bill. So I mean, that's why I think trade war does no good to US or China or the global economy for that matter. And I think for Latin American countries, like I said, some countries may gain at some front, but overall, it's not going to be conducive for the growth, right? Because if China slows down, it's going to buy significantly less from Latin American countries, be it soybean or iron ore or other commodities. So I think trade is going to promote global growth in general, if it's done well. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you very much. I'd like to return to your earlier answer about sovereignty. There once was a time when either foreign aid or foreign investment from the United States had at least a cover story of being tied to things like human rights or environmental improvement and so forth. So that kind of investment can be a carrot, not just a stick. I see the proposed excursion through Myanmar to the Bay of Bengal, and I saw what China did with the port of Piraeus in Greece, both of which had significant social and human rights problems. And their finances could have been a carrot, but it seems basically to have either become a stick or ignored the human rights and social problems of that era, of those areas. Do you think there is any genuine linkage between economic development in the big picture of planning from Beijing? Is there any linkage between environmental improvement and social improvement, or is this purely calibrated to economic wins for China and really ultimately hegemony?
So I think the 2 points related to your question. I think one thing, again, it's clear is China does not think it's in its own position to go to other countries and say, here's the money, but you need to do this item, A, B, and C, and D, right? So I don't think China thinks it's right to tell other countries how to run their own countries. So I think that is very clear. But China is aware of that its investment could in some ways worsen human rights in those different countries. For example, how to treat workers, right? And for example, land acquisition and force some of the populations off their land. And I think these things that China needs to deal with, right? This is not general how other countries run their economy, but rather, how China's projects can affect different people differently, how they can distribute the benefits and the costs in a more just way and fair way. So I think China, like I said, right, they have adopted or trying to adopt the 248 recommendations by UN Human Rights Watchdog and trying to improve their own behavior in those countries. But I don't think it's in China's position to go to the politicians and say, if you want my investment, you have to do this and that, right? I think that it's clear. And secondly, I want to make the point that I don't think all these objectives are necessarily mutually exclusive. So in other words, you build those green energies. It's good for the economy. It's also good for the environment, right? You pollute heavily. It's bad for the environment. It's also bad for the economy in the long run. And I think, China understands this, right? And that's why they invest in some of the, they do have coal mining. They do have all those extractive activities going on. But at the same time, they are also, building transmission lines to facilitate electricity transmission that are more efficient and environmental friendly. So I think in that vein, right, that these two could go together. And human rights is the same thing, right? Because we're talking about, 21st century is it's a human century. We need to cultivate human capital to be able to sustain economic growth, right? We cannot have low-skilled labor. We cannot have unproductive labor, and yet trying to develop the economy. And so I think that it's clear that, we need to respect human rights, not only just from an ethical point of view, but also from an economic point of view. Exploit the worker would not go very far. You have to cultivate that human capital. You have to invest in your people to be able to grow in a sustainable way. So I don't necessarily think those objectives are mutually exclusive.
A question up here. related to intellectual property rights. Are there any intellectual property agreements in the Phase 1 trade agreement? And what's your opinion of will we get to some equitable agreement related to intellectual property?
Okay. There's some intellectual property rights provision in the so-called Phase 1 deal, particularly related to pharmaceuticals. So China has agreed and pledged to strengthen intellectual property rights protection, especially with the pharmaceutical industries. To that, I also wanted to make 2 extra points. One is a lot of the sort of arguments and claims about intellectual property theft that is committed by China lack very substantial evidence. The evidence that they presented it's by a sort of very interesting methodology. They extrapolate, for example, how much the customs has seized the counterfeited products from China. And they base that and extrapolate how much the intellectual property rights that China has sort of stolen from the United States. So to say the very least, there's lacking some very substantive evidence to show that China is actually stealing, $500 billion or $600 billion worth of intellectual products from the United States. And in fact, China has invested heavily, for example, Huawei in Silicon Valley, and they have a lot of cooperation and collaboration in technology. So it's very difficult to just make this very outright umbrella-like argument that China is stealing $600 billion worth of intellectual property from the United States. That said, I agree, right? Individually, companies and individuals, there are intellectual property rights theft cases. But again, to say this is a state-run program to try to steal, as a country from the United States, I think we need more substantive evidence to show that. But more pertinent to your point is I think that whole intellectual property rights violation and how to strengthen protection, that's probably going to be mostly the Phase 2 deal, that negotiations, because China has ratified some of those laws and set up courts to deal with 1,300, by the way, new courts or branches of courts to deal with intellectual property rights violations since the trade war started. So I think one thing, maybe if there's any silver lining about the trade war, is it does make China pay attention to some of those issues and accelerate its reform on those fronts. Yes.
Okay, we are out of time. To quote the great poet laureate Carol Burnett, I'm so glad we had this time together. I will see you next Friday.
Thank you so much. Thanks a lot. I really appreciate it. Thank you. Hi, Scott.
I plan to see all of you Tuesday at the Schnitzer for Samantha Power. Individual tickets are now on sale. And if you like hotcakes, they're selling like that. So we will talk to you. Thanks.